Okay, I think it's time to make a start. So welcome everyone to the Fit for Commerce webinar, exploring the digital requirements for malls and meeting places in a post-COVID environment. I'll hand over to you, Steve.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. We've got an exciting panel of guests for you today. My name is Steve Brooks. I'm the pop-up expert. As the advisor to a number of companies around the globe, I help them navigate through complex retail issues. My clients include mall owners as well as retailers and people in the retail space. We have also on our panel today Gary Burrows. Gary leads the Fit for Commerce malls and meeting places consulting practice globally. He's developed and operated and facilitated large-scale mixed-use retail investments for over 30 years. He's worked in over 90 shopping centres across 36 countries, including the UK, Europe, Middle East and North Africa. Rupert Wood is an executive advisor for Fit for Commerce, focusing on malls and meeting places and leveraging 25 years of experience. Rupert has an extensive experience in the real estate sector, having worked for major operations including Lendlease, St Morden Properties, where he spent 13 years as an executive, part of the executive team. Matt Blonder is the global head of marketing, brand management and digital commerce for Reebok. He's an established retail leader who began his career at Gap. He has held leadership roles at Barnes & Noble, Toys R Us, Specialty Sports Venture and Sports Authority, to name but a few. Isabel Hees is the head of research and analytics at Alandi. She has held the analyst roles at Market, Credit Suisse, Barclays, JDX Consulting. Isabel also serves as an advisory board member for the British Property Federation Futures. And finally, Mark Burton is the managing director at Cross Border Retail. Mark has held positions of global head of cross-border retail at both CBRE and Cushman @ Wakefield, leasing director for the UK and France with McArthur Glen UK, retail estate director for Northern Europe and Foot Locker UK, and retail estate director Europe for Ralph Lauren. It's an exciting panel. I hope you're going to enjoy our discussions. Gary, perhaps you'd like to just set the stage and the tone for our discussion today.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks for being our guest moderator today as well. So I just want to run through a few slides just to introduce who Fit for Commerce are and set the tone of what's going on in the industry at the moment and the challenges that we face. So Fit for Commerce is a boutique consultancy on all things digital, e-commerce, omni-channel, business to business, enabling our clients to make smarter investment decisions on all things digital. At the end of the day, we've worked with 600 different brands and retailers and help them grow and accelerate and optimize their business models. And we're at the front lines of the digital transformation, and our team of experts are accelerating brands, retailers, malls, meeting places. So basically, we're bringing everything together and merging the digital and physical for the first time in one retail singularity. So these are just some of the brands that we've worked with, all kind of leading international brands that you can see there. In terms of the malls and meeting places side of the business, this is mostly myself and Rupert working in many different countries, all of these recognized brands, whether it's kind of Westfield, Alpha Tame, Trigranite, Legal & General, Inca Centres. So where we are now, and the challenges that we face, the pace of change is increasing massively, and the bricks and mortar retailing was going through a seismic change anyway before the pandemic, and recent announcements that 25% of malls in America will close their doors in the next 5 years, and that's also what we see across the UK and Europe, especially some of the older malls that are struggling, the town centre malls. A lot of those are being taken over by local authorities. And in fact, one was recently sold for £1, which is just astonishing. But then you've got owners like Into, owners and operators, that 2 years ago had a market cap rate of £7.2 billion, and recently went into administration and taken over by KPMG with a carried debt of £4.5 billion. So just shocking numbers, and something that we'd never have thought of a year ago, 18 months ago. Would never have thought that this would happen. But also the things that have happened in the last 3 to 4 months during lockdown, America has carried about 14 to 15% of online sales versus physical sales. That's had a 10-point jump and an evolutionary shift, and is now 25%. In the UK, it was always about 17 to 18% of online versus physical, and that's now 27 to 28%. And it's interesting how that has panned out when you consider that companies like one of the largest UK landlords, British Land, had with a 3.2 billion pound investment portfolio, have just written down their portfolio by 26%. It almost directly correlates to the online, which is quite interesting. I don't know the reality of that, but it's interesting if that's true, if that is a direct correlation. But then you've also got 10,000 stores, a conservative estimate that 10,000 stores, retail stores, will be closing the doors permanently across the US during 2020. I don't know the number internationally, but that's a horrific number, and obviously a massive impact to landlords and owners. With the retail sector on its knees and bleeding out, certainly for the spring summer, it's been hit really, really hard. Everyone's panicking about the second wave. If they lose the autumn winter fashion collection, then many more retailers will close the doors. And that in itself has created a fairly interesting dynamic, where you have people like Brookfield, who are a very large owner of malls and meeting places. They've stepped up and launched a $5 billion fund to rescue retailers that are in the malls. Also, Simon Group, they've recently announced a rescue fund, and I believe they're going to step in and help JCPenney. And departments, talking about JCPenney, Macy's, and Debenhams in the UK going into administration. Department stores seem to be particularly hard hit, and so I'm not sure how that's going to pan out. But it's going to be interesting to hear the feedback from and the debate that we go into today with our panelists. So, what are FitForCommerce doing about this? Well, FitForCommerce, a bit of shameless advertising quickly. We have a malls and meeting places business that we're carrying out digital malls assessment to clearly map out the digital footprint that malls have, and how they can develop that digital strategy moving forward, and then build that into a digital ecosystem that merges the digital and physical, but also bridges that gap between landlords and retailers, where there's been a historic distrust between landlords and retailers, certainly with transactional data and information flows, when we're now at the stage where those information flows have to increase, they have to improve. And if everyone works together, as collaboration being the new normal, if everyone works together, it can certainly improve the situation. So the meeting place methodology is, as everybody is now talking about placemaking and meeting place methodology. And we were chatting earlier about how localization and authenticity is increasingly important to our customers and our consumers. and how that affects the overall situation. I think gone are the days of the copy-paste mail where I could walk in a mall in Dubai or London or New York and look round and that have mostly the same retailers and operators in there. So I'll hand back over to Steve to see how our panelists want to debate that.
Thanks,
Those comments.
Gary. No, thank you for setting the stage for us. Just for everybody that's participating, if you do have a question that you'd like to ask one of the panelists during the discussion and it's relevant to that point, mark it with an asterisk so that we know that we should answer that straight away. But there is a recording of today's webinar, and any questions that we don't get to, we will answer at the end, or if we don't have time, then we'll forward an answer on to you from one of our panelists. So I think we're all agreed that global retailing and commercial real estate is really in a state of flux right now. Post-COVID, who knows what's going to happen. Pre-COVID, you know, we were already heading that way. So Rupert, let me start with you. A number of mall owners are on the verge of bankruptcy. Is there a digital component that you think can help them? You know, oil data is becoming the new oil, isn't it?
Hi, Steve. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, there's a question to start off with about the bankruptcy. I think, of course, there's going to be some more pain to come on this, and it's going to be quite painful for a number of operators. You know, you can only see where your income source is being affected with closures, certainly in the UK, with people like TM Lewin closing all their stores, going to online. You know, Oasis and Warehouse going into administration, Carphone Warehouse. That just gives a breadth of the sectors that are being affected. It's affecting every, you know, most retail sectors. I think as an industry, what I'd like to just point out before I go on to the digital side is, of course, and it's been well verbalized or socialized over the last few months, of these structural issues that are affecting the sector. And those do need to be addressed. And Gary just touched on lease structures and how leases need to start reflecting the trading potential of stores, physical stores, as well as and merging that omni-channel and online sales. There are clearly too many malls, there are too many shops, and that is coming quite hard and fast with the closures of shops, or people not, retailers not renewing leases, CVAs, etc. And the other point I'd make, which will influence the bankruptcy or the challenges that the sector will have, is the valuation methodology. That does need looking at once you've sorted out how you're going to tackle the multi-revenue streams that could be derived out of malls and meeting places. So there's some big meaty topics there that need to be addressed. So moving into the digital component and what role that can play as a solution to this, my feeling is that it's not one holy grail silver bullet piece of technology or app. It's actually the interplay with all of those apps and technologies, and the people that can, and the companies that can try and find a real true digital ecosystem, which Gary referred to before, is going to be the key component to me of how this is going to help landlords, mal owners, sort of navigate their way out of this process and this situation. So a digital ecosystem, I just want to make sure people really understand, that's a group of sort of interconnected information, technology, resources. So all your apps, websites, anything that you are putting tech into that can actually function as a unit. There's an interplay between them. And that to me is absolutely crucial in what is, I think, a highly volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous sector that we operate in now. And that's an ecosystem that should be made up of suppliers, customers, trading partners, applications, third-party data services and providers, and all respective technologies. And I think that is possibly the biggest challenge that everybody's got to sort of grapple with when you're firefighting. and really head down just to collect your rent, quarter day rents, or make sure you're getting supplies in there, and actually, even more importantly, that your schemes or your MALs are safe for people to enter, to actually to shop there. There's a couple of interesting stats is that from McKinsey's, 41% of businesses are struggling to balance current business while exploring the new opportunities, and I put digital into that. 48% of UK executives are really actively seeking ecosystems as a new business model. But actually, the capabilities of those executives are not there in terms of experience to be able to design and execute those ecosystems. So there's a whole piece of challenge that is coming out of this. Finally, briefly, I don't want to hog everything, but I think there's 6 elements that a digital ecosystem needs to have. You need to have the customer insights. Clearly, obviously, you need to have that. And that's not just exit surveys or understanding who comes across the threshold of your property. It's the wider piece. It's what the local community, your catchment area is looking at. So having that insight is key. And you can do that through strategic partnerships with mobile phone operators. They collect a huge amount of information. So how do you get that? The second bit is catchment and competitor research. Do you really know which retail categories should be in your project, in your MAL? And does that align with the labor profile, the catchment spend? Is that really there? That dynamic is really important. So understanding your hierarchy. Thirdly, MALs and meeting places optimization. Making sure you use all the digital tools available to you. Contactless payments, mobile, social media, mobile apps. Can you get parking charges, that frictionless experience that customers will want? Product fulfillment. Is that buy online, pick up in store? Is it buy online, return on store? Are you really, really pushing that logistics for fulfillment position? Fourthly, digital engagement. Clearly the website, app, social media integration is going to be key. And then using all of that for your business insights and analytics. So that big data, managing to cleanse it, analyze it to really drive both short-term, medium-term and long-term business planning. And the final thing is technology planning. That is, really a key challenge for MALs and meeting places to navigate that complex world of digitalization. Have you got the strategy? Do you know what you're trying to achieve? And I have to say, I think that's really hard when you've got to unlearn learned behaviors and then actually look forward when your head's down. So I think those are the biggest challenges, Steve.
Interesting take on that, Rupert. Mark, what do you think about that? What's your view about all of these bankruptcies then, and that digital component? Where do you see it going?
Well, obviously, any bankruptcy is bad news for the sector, and it doesn't really matter what your preconceived idea is of that company that goes into administration. It's just bad news, and we need to try and put a stop to that as quickly as we possibly can. But I think Rupert makes a good point that we've got a hell of a lot of unlearning to do before we can learn. And I think there are some philosophical questions out there about whether indeed landlords, MAL owners should in fact benefit from online sales. And it's my absolute belief that they should. I think there is a 50-50 chance in the modern retail world that any transaction starts online, but there's also a 50-50 chance that it didn't start online. So are we researching online and then going to buy in a shop, or are we going to look in a shop and then buy it online for some sort of perceived value? And it's fairly obvious if store sales are taking place, they should be reflected in the rent. But in the case of what we would refer to as overt showrooming, it's less clear as to how a landlord can or should benefit from those sales. And if you take examples, high street names like Nespresso or maybe even Apple, there are clearly huge showrooming elements to that, and that needs to be reflected in the rents that landlords can achieve. In the UK, and I don't want to make this too UK centric, but in the UK we have a thing called the use class order, which determines different types of retail use within a shopping centre. So it might be food and beverage, it might be straightforward apparel and footwear, it might be financial services. But there is no a category for showrooming. And if we were able to revisit the use class order and introduce a showrooming category within that, then I think landlords could benefit from that by maybe receiving some kind of kicker. It could be an automatic percentage that says these guys, no matter what you say, these guys are doing a hell of a lot of sales online as a result of us having a store. So we want, I don't know, 10% extra over what a regular retailer is paying to reflect the fact that it's showrooming. I'm just picking a number out of the air. It could be 50%, could be 5%. But I do think it needs to be done. I also think that store returns need to be reflected in the rents that people are paying. And if there is, this may require legislative change whereby every retailer knows what every store is turning over. That's just a given. They know what's happening. The fact that so many of these store returns are going in and registering through the till and not appearing on any rent needs to be addressed. And I think if retailers accept that they are 50% of the partnership in a mall environment and they are more open with their turnovers, then I think we can make or capture on store returns and reflect those in any rents that we pay. And clearly the most equitable way of doing that, in my opinion, is to move to turnover rents as quickly as we possibly can. The former evidence-based model where some coffee shop or phone shop down the road can come in and screw your rent for that by having a business that bears no relevance to yours whatsoever, those days have got to be over. Retailers and landlords need to accept that there is a huge common interest at play here. It's important that they realize that we have to find an equitable solution. And the most equitable solution to me is to move to turnover rents rather than evidence-based on rates per square foot. The fabric of our society pretty much depends on this, because if retail is allowed, physical retail is allowed to reduce too much, then our towns and our centres, our shopping centres and our high streets will decline to a point where they will become almost no-go areas, ghettos, if you like. And we have to preserve that. We know it's going to shrink, but it can't shrink below a certain level. And as I say, retailers have to be honest and open with their declaration of turnovers. And landlords need to understand that the days of just saying, well, fine, you go, we'll replace you with somebody else, are well and truly over. There's nowhere near enough supply. There are some great retailers out there with some great stories and some great businesses, but there's nowhere near enough of them to replace the ones that are going to fail. And I also think that the banks need to be brought into some kind of government support initiative which is going on there, because landlords need banks, tenants need landlords, landlords need tenants. There's this symbiotic relationship, and the banks are being left out at the moment. And I think it's not fair to expect landlords to go bust because they can't change their arrangements with their banks. Sure. So I think there are some support measures which need to change going forward. I strongly encourage the change to turnover rents as quickly as we possibly can. I definitely want to see landlords be able to benefit from online sales, and I've suggested a few ways that I think we can capture that. Over to you, Steve. Looks like you've frozen on me.
Steve's frozen. May I just interject on that one as well? Yeah, I was talking to a retailer recently who was telling me that when they opened up a store in a particular city, there was a 40% increase to online sales in that geographical catchment area. So, you know, when they didn't have that shop window, as it were, when they didn't have that customer engagement, that physical customer engagement, then the online sales were much lower. But when they open a store and you have that kind of that emergence of the digital and physical and the shop window, and because we're all social animals, we want to go in and touch and feel and experience the brand as well as see the brand. Yeah, there was 2% increase.
I strongly believe in the halo effect, Gary. I think there is a relationship between having physical stores and the quality and success of your online business. But what we have to do is to find a balance. The online sales and the physical sales have to complement each other and not compete with each other. You can't. It's not a one or the other philosophy in my mind. If we can make physical shops affordable, for the first time in my lifetime, retailers have got a credible alternative to having physical shops. And if they can't make them affordable, then they will move online. So it's up to us to help them find the value of physical retail and for landlords to work with them to help them complement their online sales, because online sales ain't going away.
Yeah. Well, it looks as though we've lost Steve. So maybe I think the next question was aimed for you anyway, Mark. Unless anybody, any of the other panelists have input on that one.
I think, yeah, that was my question there, Gary. So I think we're on to Q3. I don't want to hog the
okay.
Hog the airtime.
Who was Q3?
I can take that one, Gary.
Okay, cool. So how has COVID-19 affected online sales, and what impact will this have on Mal's a Meeting Place, retailers, tenant mix, repurposing? So, you know, with the impact of online sales, are retailers going to downsize? Are we going to see repurposing, a lot of repurposing? And if so, how's that going to affect the overall dynamic of a mall or a meeting place in terms of the tenant mix, the zoning and the clustering?
Yeah, so my expertise is on the online side of things, so I might not be able to answer all kind of facets of the question as you posed it. So welcome, other feedback, to round out the answer. But certainly, as I think about how things have changed, not a surprise to anyone that the current state of things has accelerated adoption and behavior across the entire ecosystem and across the consumer set significantly. So what might have taken 3 years has happened in the last 3 months, which for someone on my side of things is incredibly exciting, as we were talking before the panel began. But for a lot of the folks who are joining the discussion, it's probably incredibly frightening. So as I take my digital hat off and I put my physical hat on, it seems to me that the change has likely forced a lot of slow to adopt or resistant to adopt folks to do so, which means you've got a whole group of people who have been introduced to brands, experiences, retailers who might not have otherwise met them for some time. So there is an increased audience pool, which there's a lot of benefit to be leveraged. And so the question for me, if I put myself in the position of a lot of the audience here, is how are you going to engage that new audience pool? How are you going to leverage them in order to bring them into your spaces, in order to to translate that power into physical sales? I think in addition, you've got a lot of people who have spent months and months and months physically isolated and are looking forward to months more of physical isolation in some way, shape, or form, which means that there's this pent up desire and passion and demand for physical interaction. And malls and meeting places, for me, in this next phase of retail and consumerism, actually have a competitive advantage in so much as they can meet the demand in a socially distant way. Because they have physical space, because they have size, and they can use that space in different and unique ways because they're less constrained by square footage, and can bring consumers in and embrace them in a way that is socially distant and safe. There's so many things that people have given up over the course of the last few months that were really powerful and meaningful to them. And, the memory is still very strong. And so the question for me would be, how are malls and meeting spaces going to step up and step in and open their arms to that desire in a way that is, truly meaningful? I don't anticipate a significant reduction in online selling as a function of the world opening back up. I think what like I said, we've just seen an acceleration of the inevitable. And I worry that people might think to themselves, well, this will pass. And when it passes, we'll go back to, the previous normal. I don't think that's the case at all. And so for me, there needs to be iterative change. And now's the time to be making steps towards that iterative change. It was Rupert mentioned a moment ago that it's very, very hard to focus on the future when you're just trying to stay alive. And that's a very, very real issue for so many people. But the future cannot be ignored. If you're constantly just a duck, on water treading, like crazy beneath the surface, you're not going to have any energy for when you're out of the water. And so, my question to the folks is, how are you allocating calories in your system to thoughts towards the future? How are you setting aside the time, the brain power, the resources? And in many cases, how are you bringing in fresh, different thinkers? Because Rupert also mentioned, very rightly so, it can be very, very hard to shift your paradigm when you only, you've only focused in one direction. So I think, the base question is, how does online selling affect, malls and meeting places? And really, to me, the question is, how are malls and meeting places in their organizational structures, their thought structures, and their caloric expenditure structures, if you will, changing to meet this rising demand and this rising need? There's some really fascinating things, and we'll talk about it in a little bit with the future question, that I think could be amazingly beneficial and could be really step changing. But the powers that be, the brilliant minds behind these spaces that once were so powerful do need to move to meet the current state. But I don't think the tide is going to shift back, to where it was. It's just going to continue to move out from the shore. And the question is, are we moving out to meet it?
Yeah, I fully agree with those comments. And Steve, if I could just close this one off and move on to the next one.
Sure.
So, yeah, I fully agree with that. And it was said recently to me that 2030 had just arrived in 2020. And, the digitization of the world and everything that's happening within it, it takes human beings 21 days to adapt to a new pattern of behavior. And those 21 days have come and gone with the 3-month lockdown. And it's only kind of increasing. So if people get used to that online behavior, then a lot of the online behavior that we have today is going to be sticky. And looking at the physical spaces and what's happening with those physical spaces, I think there is going to be some big change there, because when you look at Generation Z, everyone's talking about Generation Z. They don't need to be in that physical space to resonate with your brand. If there is a truly merged digital and physical brand experience, customer journey and customer experience, then they can be sat at home on the sofa playing a video game and ordering, being a customer, or sat on the beach and being your customer. They don't have to. But historically, where I was driving people to the meeting place, driving people to the mall, all about visitation and then dwell time and upsell. But in the new world that we're in, hey, it's a different paradigm. And maybe if I can ask Isabel, in terms of the physical space, what are your thoughts about repurposing?
So actually, really encouragingly, a number of the points I was going to raise on this question have already been discussed during the course of this webinar, which is brilliant. But I'm just going to expand on a few. So, certainly what we have seen in the last 3 months has been, very different to what we've experienced in the retail world. But I would certainly argue, and as some of the panelists have already alluded to, it is essentially an acceleration of some of the existing trends that we've seen in the market. So, those are polarization between different types of retail location and retailer, a shift towards experience and experiential, a trend towards actually both localism and urbanization that's really going to accelerate and exacerbate some of the challenges and actually the opportunities that we've seen, of late in the retail sector. Certainly, over the last 3 months, we've seen that, any physical store experience today needs to be as unphysical as possible. But, longer term, expectations are going to continue to rise again, and shopping centres, malls and high streets are going to need to transform again fast to meet some of those shifting expectations from consumers. So definitely we're going to see more flagship style stores, and that's going to probably become the norm, where the number of locations that retailers need to be in and occupiers need to be in shrinks. That's not necessarily going to be the case for all occupiers, certainly, but probably is going to be a trend that we see. And the ability really for customers to move seamlessly between online, physical delivery channels is really going to be paramount in the future. And I'd say specifically for shopping centres and high streets, that omni-channel experience is going to be even more critical, to have the seamless experience between different types of location to purchase an item from. And while probably the everyday convenience-based retailing side is going to continue being carried out in physical stores, I think really in order to persuade customers to come back to physical space over and above just an essential need for a product or a service, shopping centres are going to need to provide something that couch surfing, quite frankly, doesn't. And they're going to need to think in terms of services and become destinations in their own right that combine actually the best of retail with the best of experience. Experience does not mean in itself experiential. It does not mean that every store needs to be equipped with VR headsets and have no products for sale. It's just that space needs to provide the best possible offer and experience, and has it, having a unique and identifiable purpose to its visitors, and whether that's a local community hub or a leisure anchored supermall. And I think from that, we've touched upon it briefly in terms of commenting actually on understanding customers and data. The traditional mall of today, whose value is pretty much measured solely in terms of footfall levels and probably revenue per square foot, is likely to die off, and we're going to have to replace that with other means of measuring success, where we have an environment with a diverse range of occupiers and of uses. But that's not only going to enable us to understand and evaluate the value of a space, but also really get to grips with understanding how visitors are interacting with retail spaces. And really it comes down then to understanding what customers want and need from a space. And again, it's the comment made that it's not a cookie cutter solution. It's really landlords being agile and innovative, and adapting spaces to really fit that unique purpose for the retail location. And actually, it may be that some retail locations of today actually don't stack up as retail locations in the future. It may be that they are redeveloped and repurposed to entirely different uses, and that will be completely dependent on, you know, the location of that space and the local requirements and local needs. And you know, again, to probably pick up a point that Rupert made, is that actually that investment into our retail spaces that is probably going to drive relatively bold decision making is going to be the only way to make transformative interventions in these spaces and actually ensure the future success. And it seems like an odd step forwards that actually in a period of economic uncertainty, I'm suggesting even more capital investment and, you know, even more intervention. But I think that attitude from the landlord to evolve a space to meet customer needs and their attitude towards investment and, you know, acceleration of activity is going to be one of the key differentiators between the winners and the losers of the retail market. So, you know,
Isabel, do you see a lot more collaboration between pure online retailing and pure bricks and mortar retailing? I'm thinking about the relationship that Kohl's has here in the US with Amazon as a kind of drop-off point for returns and pick-up point for purchases. Do you think that there's a route there where pure online and pure bricks and mortar can collaborate more and bring a stronger offer to the consumer?
Yeah, certainly. I think there's certainly, you know, a willingness to do that. We've seen, you know, from the retail perspective. I think again there is probably some steps to be made from a landlord perspective to be able to, you know, evolve and improve the space to facilitate that. I think the way malls are kind of set up traditionally doesn't always support having a very functional and frequently used omni-channel type of offer, but definitely would agree with that. And actually, really interestingly, we do some of the kind of old school traditional, you know, intercept surveys where we actually ask 10,000 people across our portfolio on an annual basis what they do in our shopping centres and what they like. And there is a real direct correlation between spend in store and use of omni-channel. So actually driving people to physical stores to fulfill their online purchases or to, you know, either return on a purchase means that they are far more likely to actually spend in store. And the results of the survey were that people who came into a store or into a shopping centre to use click and collect actually spent £48 extra per visit than those who did not. That's not £48 in total, that's actually £48 additional to somebody who just came to the shopping centre to shop that physical location. That's, you know, certainly from a kind of landlord perspective and physical space perspective, but I think one of the kind of key shifts and key changes that is going to have to happen in the retail environment, again, I know we touched upon this, but I think it's incredibly important, is the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. We mentioned, you know, going to turnover leases. You know, there's certainly an appetite in the market from both landlords and tenants to do that, but I think there needs to be, you know, an additional level of trust and collaborative working between both sides to ensure that you are really sharing both in the upside and the downside, and that you work together to create really successful spaces that really meet the needs of your customers in the future.
Sure. We've had a question come in. Sorry, Matt. I just want to pick up on that point, if I may. We've had a question come in about does the panel feel that we should move to 100% turnover rents, despite the need for landlords to guarantee a certain rental level to justify their bank borrowings? What do you think about that?
I think it alludes to what Mark was saying earlier, that banks need to be involved in this whole process as well. We're in a different world. The model of a mall or a shopping centre has hardly changed in the past 60 or 70 years, and we're now in a situation where it's being forced to change. It's being forced to adapt and evolve at a rate that we're not comfortable with. Landlords, retailers, and banks that are supporting this whole business model. So, I'll pass that over to Mark.
Yeah, I mean, sorry. Quickly, Isabel, I'll hand over to you. But I think 100% of retailers should move to turnover rents? Yes. Do I believe it should be only 100%, actually 100% of turnover that forms the rent? No, I think there is definitely a case for base rent and turnover. And one of the arguments which I get presented with a lot when I'm arguing this is it screws up the valuations. Well, I've worked for MacArthur Glen for 2 years. The factory outlet model has existed on base rent and turnover very successfully since its inception. I've sat in valuation meetings where the valuers have had to scratch their heads a little bit harder. They've applied different yields and they've arrived at perfectly satisfactory valuations, which banks buy into. So I think it's a total red herring to say that no one will ever value it, because they will, and they do. And we have to arrive at something which is more equitable. We have to Rupert's point, we have to unlearn a lot of what we've done, and we have to do things differently. And to my mind, that way of doing it is very equitable. And if we've got international retailers who are trading in France, Germany, as well as places like the UK and the US, they're already paying turnover rents. They think it's perfectly acceptable to do it in those markets where it's perfectly acceptable. It's only in markets where it's different and difficult that they almost have this mindset that they need to change. It's very doable, but there has to be, as you say, openness on both sides.
Great. Isabel, you had another point you wanted to make.
No, those were absolutely the points I was going to make. So.
Great minds.
I have a point, Steve.
Yes, please, Rupert.
Just very briefly, I think Mark's made a valid point. I think there is a role for turnover rents. Absolutely, there is a need for that absolute trust and understanding and that data. So that relationship, of course, needs resetting. There's a lot of talk on both sides in the press, certainly in the UK. I'm slightly amazed that it's still raging in this day and age, but the battle lines were drawn because of the Landlord and Tenant Act. I think that is a fundamental change that needs to happen to start to force landlords and operators, retailers, F&B operators to start having true dialogue about what landlords are trying to provide is a platform for retailers and those businesses to maximize the sales. And if you don't do that as a landlord, then why should you benefit from the turnover? If you start delivering really good services to that, then I would expect retailers to participate more thoroughly in that debate. The interesting fact I was amazed to see out of the Savills report the other week was that actually 50% of landlords believe that their leases were not going to change. I found that incredible because, okay, there might be the other 50%, there's lease re-gears and everything else, but landlords have got to really start to understand what the dynamics of retailers and what those businesses are. And then you can start repitching it. The final point is valuations are coming off so hard that actually you can start playing, if you have the CapEx and you make sure you have the good relationships with your banks, you're going to have the opportunity to renegotiate a lot of these leases to ensure that your position and your property is in the right hierarchy, serving the right purpose in your locality to be successful. And that's where I think you're going to be a winner.
So do you think then if retailers are performing below a certain level, that the landlord should be able to replace them with a better operator much quicker? I mean,
Well,
that's a question we've just been asked by somebody.
Yeah, well, Steve, sorry, I'm just going to jump straight in because what I was going to is about flexibility, and by being really insightful about your customers, and customers not as just people coming in to shop, it's actually your customers as a landlord, your retailers and your operators, and understanding what sorts of sectors should be targeted, and deeply understanding the difference between grocery, fashion, footwear, accessories, F&B. If you can understand that as a landlord, you're going to give yourself a really good chance of being able to be flexible and understanding which operators could have long-term cycle, what I call long cycle lease structures, and what retailers or operators could have short cycle leases or occupational licenses, because some only want an hour, some might only want a week, some might want 6 months, some might want a month over. If you can cater for that, you're then going to be giving a lot of flexibility. You're going to put yourself in a really strong position against the competition. Sorry.
Sure. This is a really interesting point. I'd like to come back to it at the end if we can, guys, because we've got a couple of questions, but I just want to get through the questions that we had for today. But so, Gary, there are going to be winners and losers post-COVID. Mm-hmm. What's changed in the world for that now? Who are they going to be?
Well, if you look at department stores are being decimated. If you look at some of the retailers that didn't invest in digital when the going was good, and they're now suffering really badly. They're the ones that are kind of not going to make it through this situation. But retailers that did invest in digital and do have those e-com platforms and do have that customer engagement, they're the ones that are surviving, and they're the ones that are actually coming through this quite strongly, and will only get stronger as we move forward, because it's embracing that digital and physical. When you look at any mall, any shopping centre, probably 20% of your retailers, between 10 and 20% of your retailers are going to be locally authentic or locally unique retailers, and then they're not going to have the ability to or the financial support to develop these big e-com systems. But you've got landlords like take Dubai Mall, for instance. They've created a digital twin where they've created this kind of digital mall gamified environment that has last mile logistics, that has all of the services, that has provisions, that has interesting customer experience and customer journey. And so basically you can be in a digital space and be resonating with that mall or that meeting place, or you can be physically there. By the fact that you now have a 24/7 operating business, not just to say a 10 or a 12-hour operating business, then hey, you're increasing your market share, you're increasing your engagement, your resonance with customers, access to customers. They can buy what they want, when they want, how they want, and have it delivered where they want at a time they want. So for me, it's people that are investing heavily in digital or have invested heavily in digital are going to be the winners, and those that haven't, we can see on a day-by-day basis that retailers are falling over. I suppose I'd bounce that over to Matt. I mean, he's probably more capable of answering that question than I.
Yeah, Matt, what's your take on that?
Personally, I think, all of the things that are being discussed here are important components of just the basic shopping journey, and it can't be ignored. But when I think about who's going to win and who's going to lose, it's about the folks who are taking a step further and who are thinking about their digital ecosystem not as a another iteration of the physical ecosystem, but instead think about the digital ecosystem as a really meaningful complement to the physical and vice versa. So I think the folks who were just looking at how do I digify, if you will, my current offering, it's really table stakes, and there are, large digital platforms that have already answered those questions and are doing it quite handily. So the question for me would be, how are malls and meeting spaces actually differentiating and using their unique value proposition to create accretive value for the consumer's journey? So, granted, there are a variety of different consumers who have different needs, and we've talked a lot about being hyper-local in your approach, which I think is the absolute right way to go. But the differentiation between those hyper-localities can be very, very vast. And I think the folks who are going to win are the folks who look around them and say, who is within, an appropriate radius? What does that consumer actually need added to his, her, or their journey within a day, week, or month? And how can we provide that additive value? So if you're in a location that is, I'm making it up, but a more university-centric location, what are university students looking for to add to their day, right? So, what's missing from so many of these folks' lives right now, and will continue to be missed for some time, is, like a festival culture, right? Festival culture is a very, very meaningful part of the Gen Z experience right now, and it's been ripped from, from their grasp. So how does a physical retail location, a mall, meeting place, create the same sense of energy, wonder, belonging, excitement, that's currently missing? Isabel made mention of gaming culture. There is absolutely a need for aggregation of people and co-location of people to up their gaming game, if you will. And so how are physical spaces meeting that particular need? You've got large tranches of people whose lives have been totally upended in the current world because they've got their children at home and they're having to work while they educate. And that's incredibly difficult. Is there some value that can be added through these physical locations in that space? So, for me, I think the folks who are going to win are the folks who lift their head up and look beyond their current value proposition and say, where do we have white space that we can actually tap into and we can add the value? And if I'm, in the audience's space, that's the question I'm asking myself every day. What do we need to do differently? Not just a little bit better or a little bit more digitally, but what do we need to transform and think about radically differently in order to be successful in the future?
Isabel, have you got some thoughts on that? What do malls need to do radically to make those changes?
So, well, I think actually my suggestions would probably be slightly less radical. So certainly from one end, the destination types of malls could be doing absolutely everything that Matt touched upon. I think there's still actually quite a way to go on the other end of the scale, the kind of slightly more, the smaller mall, the more community focused mall, to make the experiences seamless. So very, very obvious things. It's not just from a mall perspective, but actually that seamless interaction between retail in physical spaces and online is just really understanding, people are making less and less trips to physical space. Trips are becoming ever more purposeful. People are not just necessarily going to a mall to kind of walk around a window shop. They're going for a reason because there's a product they want to purchase or an activity they want to complete or a service they want to partake in. Things such as just understanding availability of products in store. If you want to buy something but you'd rather touch it before you buy it, or you're going, getting your car, driving 20 minutes to your local shopping centre, you want to know that the item is there before you get there. Otherwise it's a wasted trip and you're probably unlikely to go again. So very simple things such as that, I think, are going to make a huge difference in supporting people's ever more purposeful trips. And I think that's going to be even more exacerbated as a result of COVID. People don't want to make wasted trips to physical spaces when they don't have to. And that's, I think, really going to ensure that there is that seamless experience between the online and the physical space. And I think there's a bit of a problem with us always thinking about what big brands could do, you know, big destination schemes could be doing, but I think there needs to be the same attention paid across, you know, both ends of the scale, from the large department and the anchored, you know, super mall, all the way again, you know, as I said, to that kind of community hub that actually serves a multitude of purposes to its visitors.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I just want to make one point, because I think it's important, right? So what Isabel brings up is, don't lose sight of the near term, you know, for sake of the long, but it's also the reverse. Don't lose sight of the long for sake of the near. So if I'm, you know, if I'm trying to think about how I create success, I've got great minds focused on today for today. I've got great minds, and a different set of great minds, quite frankly, because it's hard to make that shift. A different set of great minds thinking about today for tomorrow. And then I've got a third set of great minds thinking about tomorrow for tomorrow, right? So you really do break it up, and what's the foundational that I need to fix today, but without losing the traction for the future, so you're not constantly trying to catch up. And if you break down the caloric energy against each of these tranches of work, you ensure that you have the best platform for success and you're not constantly trying to catch up.
Thanks, Matt. Great point. Great point. I just want to dive in with a couple of questions that we've had through. So the first one we've had is, do you think that tenants are going to want to contribute more towards operational costs via the service charge to ensure that landlords provide more experiences needed to meet these new changes? Mark, I think that's right in your wheelhouse. What do you think?
Do I think they're willing to? Probably not, is the honest answer. Do I think they would require some kind of value for money in order to get their checkbooks out? Of course they would. Do I think that the experience culture that everyone's been going on about for the last year or two is over? Yes, quite frankly, I think it possibly is. I think our retailing experiences post-COVID are going to be much more value-led, much more based on sustainability, green credentials. So I think landlords are not going to be required to spend on a 98 square mile digital screen outside the centre in order to attract people. You know, if Perspex has become the new exposed brick, then I think chipboard is going to become the new Perspex. And I think the atmospheres that we will see in our shops and our shopping centres will change hugely, accelerated by COVID.
Thanks for that. Rupert, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think I have a view on life is that if you don't ask, you don't get, but you have to then you have to set it out in the right way. I think in the past, I've been guilty of it in the past, in that you go in there as a landlord and say, that's what it is. Take it or leave it. Great. You know, that's a good relationship builder, isn't it? And I think that probably, you know, that's quite a long time ago from my point of view. But I think landlords have really got to understand as I said before, what are the drivers for their tenants to be successful? Because if your tenants are successful, you're going to be successful. So you've got to really, really drill down into the detail of what are you offering in terms of additional operational costs, and is that really going to help them drive their revenues, their sales, their customers to their shop to go and deliver it. So I think it's all to play for, but you've got to then properly set it out clearly. It's got to be backed by data. It's got to be understanding what your customers are to be able to help your tenants then make those decisions. Say, yeah, we will contribute to a click and collect facility because we are going to be using it. So sure. I think it's all a really good microcosm of the relationship challenges that are evolving and coming forward at the moment.
Absolutely. Just one more then before we close. Certainly this is a bit more UK centric as well. In the UK, do you think that the movement towards turnover based leases is going to mean the end of the L&T Act? Isabel, what's your thought on that?
I'm muting myself. Short answer, I mean, no, not the end of it, but hopefully make some strides towards meaning less and less leases are actually fall under the Landlord and Tenant Act. I mean, it's an act that was written up, over 50, well, gosh, many years ago, 60 years ago now.
30 years ago, absolutely, yeah.
And certainly, probably does not reflect the reality of landlord and tenant relationships in the modern day, and certainly does not support the evolution of landlord and tenant relationships as we've discussed on this panel, in terms of flexibility of both rent and flexibility in terms of lease term, that we've kind of been advocating during this webinar.
Yeah, and the fact that we refer to something that was drafted in or enacted in 1954 is nonsense, and we have to get rid of that as soon as we possibly can. And I'm not saying we go to lawlessness as a replacement. We need something, but it needs to reflect reflect the modern world, and that is different than it was 3 months ago, let alone 60 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point to end on, Mark. Listen, Gary had to drop off, but Rupert, Mark, Matt, Isabel, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to bring up everybody's contact details here, how you can get hold of everybody that you've seen today. I want to thank you all for joining the Fit for Commerce webinar today, and we'll see you all again soon. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.